Hey there, and welcome back to my kitchen garden. I just love mornings in the garden. I don't know about you. So I thought today we would just have a chat. Have you ever wondered if there is one right answer to pruning tomato suckers? I know I've had a lot of questions about that. Or whether to plant hardneck or softneck garlic, or what kind of pathway to choose to go between your raised beds, and why I chose gravel and the pros and cons between the two. These are topics I've been asked about in recent videos and others I've shared this time of year. So I thought it would be fun to address them in a Q&A type video. While I may not be able to reply to every comment, I do read as many as I can, and your questions often spark great conversations and new ideas. The first question comes from the Garden family, and they have a great YouTube channel themselves. I totally recommend that you check them out. But they were asking a question in response to this video where I shared the transformation of this entire garden space called From Empty to Abundant. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the stone pathways now that you've had them for a couple of seasons. We have regretted putting stone pathways down in the past, and I think they worked better for people willing to spray herbicides. So that was a fantastic question, and it's one that I get quite a bit. My original garden space has raised beds and it's all grass in between. I don't have any stone or anything else. I have played around with putting landscape fabric below mulch, and that works okay. But with this space, we decided to go with river rock. And part of it was because we already had river rock out here when we had the trampoline and the above ground pool, which is where I'm sitting now. But we decided to continue it when we built out this space. That was the main reason that we did it, just because we already had the rock in place. But also we realized that it really takes a lot of time and effort to weed eat around raised beds if you put raised beds in a space where there's grass. That doesn't mean that this is the best option, because as the Garden family pointed out, yes, weeds do come up from the rock, and it becomes a nuisance, especially if you're not willing to spray the Roundup and the herbicides that a lot of people do. And honestly, I haven't found a good organic type spray for this. If you know of something that works well for you, please put in the comments. I am totally up for that, because there are some spaces in this area that get really overgrown, mainly around my U-shaped garden bed, which has been here for the longest time. I don't have as much trouble with it here just because this is a brand new space, and I do think it makes a difference how thick you lay landscape fabric, which is what I totally recommend. I'm not a fan of landscape fabric in general, especially in a in-ground garden. I have seen Bermuda grass power its way through landscape fabric. But for an application like this, laying it down before you put a few inches of stone down, I've found that it actually works fairly well. There's another drawback though to this rock area that I didn't anticipate, and it's actually quite inconvenient, and that is that it's really hard to get my wheelbarrow in around the beds. Now, I talked about in that last video about the spacing between the beds, and that's a challenge itself, but what I'm talking about here is the fact that the wheelbarrow wheels sink in this stone. So whenever I'm trying to wheel in compost or anything like that, I pretty much can't even put it in here, and I can't even usually go from one place to another. It's like rolling the wheelbarrow through quicksand. I think that's because it's the nature of this river rock. If there was a finer gravel that we were to use, which I think is more expensive, I think that would have been easier, but it makes it really difficult, if not impossible, to get a full wheelbarrow full of anything in this garden space. That's probably the most frustrating part of this whole stone setup. Now, a lot of people ask me, well, why don't I just put mulch down, maybe over the landscape fabric? And the reason we don't do that is because mulch eventually will break down into what will be soil. And so initially, while that's a great option, eventually you're gonna deal with seeds that birds drop or that fly in from the wind, and they're going to create weeds eventually because that mulch will break down. Now, you could continue adding mulch and that's fine, but the good part about stone is you don't have to reapply it. It's not going to break down in our lifetime, most likely. And so it's a one and done type thing. The only thing that I really have to do is just pick the occasional weed or grass that makes its way up. And I do have to be careful with when I am hauling that compost, not dropping it in the rocks, because as soon as I have any kind of dirt in the rocks, eventually a weed is gonna pop up. So I've got pros and cons to each. I'm happy with this space. I'm happy that we did this, but if you're looking for options for yourself, it is helpful to know what you might be dealing with. The next question has to do with garlic. I'm getting ready to harvest my garlic, and in this video I showed how to know when to harvest, not too early and not too late. And from that video I received this question. I see that you plant both hardneck and softneck garlic. Maybe you can explain the reasons for your choice. I find that hardneck garlic has cloves that are closer to size to each other and much easier to peel and use, while softneck garlic has cloves that keep getting smaller as you get to the center of the bulb until they become largely unusable. I'd like to know your reasoning and whether you consider one type better than the other or just mostly equal. All right, so that's a great question because I do grow both hardneck and softneck garlic. Now, the biggest consideration for me is that I am in Arkansas, zone 8A, and softneck garlic typically grows a lot better for me than hardnecks, mainly because softneck garlic is better for warmer regions and hardneck garlic is better for colder regions. But for those of us who can grow both, there's definitely differences between the two. This person was right. Hardneck garlic has larger cloves and they are much easier to cook with. They also have a little bit more flavor nuance. You can get spicier ones and they just have a lot more culinary adaptability, maybe would be what I would say. But if you're used to buying garlic at the grocery store, all of that's going to be softneck. So you're probably pretty used to a fairly uniform softneck garlic. Another thing is that softneck garlic stores for much longer. My softneck garlic will usually last me until the next season, and so I'm able to not ever have to buy garlic at the grocery store because I grow softneck. Hardneck I usually use right away because it typically doesn't store as long. So I enjoy growing both because I can, but I do grow more softneck than hardneck because they do better in my climate. So if you're in an area where you can grow both, I recommend testing it to see which ones grow better for you and decide which ones you like the most, because I don't think there's going to be one right answer for everyone, but it's always helpful to know the difference between the two. But honestly, between the two, if I could grow both equally, I would probably choose hardneck. The next question came from an observation of the zucchini plant growing in my green stalk when I shared the May and June garden tasks in this video. She asked, what zucchini are you growing in the blue-green stalk? Is it a regular variety or a dwarf version? This type of zucchini is a new one for me. It's called Astia, and the reason I bought it is because it is supposed to be a compact bush-type zucchini variety that is well suited for container growing and small gardens. It's a hybrid, early maturing variety, which I wanted because squash vine borer gets here pretty quickly. And it's also known for its abundant and flavorful fruits. Astia is also known for powdery mildew resistance, which I absolutely have to have. I realized that I spent way too much time battling powdery mildew with my zucchini, squash, and cucumbers, and once I started buying seeds that said more disease resistance, I haven't had any issues with powdery mildew. So that's been a game changer in my garden altogether. But I also grew it because of its compact growth habit. I knew I wanted to grow it in the green stalk. However, I think this compact growth habit may depend on where you're growing it. In my raised bed, you can see that it is nothing but compact. And in the green stalk, it did produce fewer than it did in my raised bed. Now, it still produced plenty, but that raised bed zucchini has been prolific. I've been harvesting a few every single day. It's crazy. So I do think no matter what kind of zucchini or squash that you're growing, I do think the amount of organic matter in the soil and just the amount of space that it gets, I think that plays a role in how large the plant can get. So if you're growing something like Astia or something that says it has a bush habit in a container, I feel like it'll be good to make sure to stay contained, so to speak, because that may be the type of growth habit that you're wanting. Next, I have another question on garlic. One year I grew garlic in 3 different spaces: raised beds, ground beds, and containers, because I wanted to compare how they would perform. In response to that video, I was asked, did you cut back on watering in the last weeks before harvest? I read that you're supposed to. I saw that you interplanted with peppers and wondered if you had adjusted your watering. Okay, so that is a fantastic question. And the answer that I gave is pretty much the standard answer, and it applies for me in my climate. I typically harvest garlic in June. Early June, mid-June, late June. It kind of depends on the season. But in my climate here in Arkansas, it is typical for us to have rains that start tapering off about the same time that I would normally cut back on watering. So I really don't have to water a whole lot unless there's some kind of dry spell until usually late June. In other words, nature kind of does that for me. But yes, if I was completely dependent on my irrigation system, I would start cutting back on the amount of watering as we got closer to harvest, within a couple of weeks, even up to a month before harvest, because garlic, like any other root crops, they do a lot better if they don't get as much water closer to harvest. And it also helps to prevent rot. Now with the case of rain, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. With peppers, that's a really great question because peppers thrive with water, but my peppers are usually pretty small at about this time. Usually they've only been in the ground for about a month. And so I find that the amount of rain that we get or the amount of irrigation that I get, even dialing it back a little bit, is sufficient for them. They really don't start taking off until the garlic is harvested anyway, so I really haven't had an issue with that. But that's a fantastic question. Next, let's talk about tomatoes. In this video I recorded a few years ago, I shared 3 methods of trellising tomatoes and the pros and cons of each one. I also talked about why I didn't prune my suckers at that time. That, of course, led to this question that a lot of gardeners ask. Just curious, why don't you prune out your suckers? You can increase your yield by doing so. I know not all tomatoes need it, but most of them benefit from it. All right, so that is the perennial question I think that all new gardeners ask. And I actually have changed my tone on this since I created that video. And the reason that I didn't prune my suckers, especially at that time, is because several years ago I did a side-by-side test. I had 2 rows of tomatoes, indeterminate, so just to lay the groundwork here. Determinate tomatoes like Romas, they don't need to be pruned because they grow to a specific height and then produce their fruit. It's the indeterminate ones that we want to keep an eye out on suckers if we want to prune them out. But I did this side-by-side test with indeterminate tomatoes. One I pruned, one I didn't, and then I weighed the harvest to see which one performed better. Ultimately, the tomatoes that I didn't prune, I pruned out no suckers whatsoever, gave me a larger harvest in terms of weight of tomato. And I believe there was another study done by a university that confirmed that. And basically what it said, if I'm remembering correctly, is that if you don't prune your tomatoes, then it produced more by weight. But if you do prune them, the tomatoes themselves that do grow are going to be larger, which makes sense because the plant is able to give more energy to fewer fruit. However, I've realized since then that the answer is a lot more nuanced than that, and a lot of it depends on where you're located. One thing that I found is that in my area, we deal with early blight, septoria leaf spot, 2 fungal diseases that a lot of people deal with. And what that means is I have to prune a lot of stems anyway. As the disease takes hold, I need to prune them out to try to prevent the disease from spreading. And also later in the season, when the fungal diseases aren't as big of an issue because it's not raining as much, tomato hornworm shows up, which sometimes can eat a whole stem in one night. So I have found that not pruning them in general actually works better because I have more buffer, so to speak, when I have to prune out diseased foliage or if a tomato hornworm starts going and I don't really recognize it. One year I realized, you know what? The tomato hornworm is pruning for me. Go figure. And it wasn't really a bad thing. I do think it does depend on where you're located. I think in areas where there's not as much fungal pressure, you may not have to be so diligent with pruning your tomatoes, but areas that are very wet, especially throughout the summer, you would probably want to prune your suckers more because the more airflow you can give your tomatoes, the less likely they're gonna have a really bad outbreak of these fungal diseases that thrive on that moist environment. Another thing that I realized is that it really does depend on how I'm growing them and how I am trellising them. So if I'm growing them up a cattle panel trellis, like I showed in that video, I haven't found it super necessary to prune them because all I need to do is just take all the foliage, all the stems, and tie them up against the tomato trellis, and then I'm able to get more harvest. But in a situation like the one behind me, I have pruned more of these suckers. I haven't gotten to all of them. We've got a few rogue ones you can kind of see, but I found that if I'm growing them in a compact space like this, where the tomato plants are fairly close to each other already, I do need to be a little bit more diligent with pruning the suckers, especially lower on the plant, because it can go really crazy really fast. Ultimately then, I think it really depends on where you're located and what your environment is, how close you are planting your tomatoes to each other, and what kind of trellis method that you're using to make that decision. If I'm growing my tomatoes inside a large tomato cage, I'm not pruning those out because they have plenty of room to grow. They're probably spaced a little bit further out. But if I'm growing them closer together, then I probably am going to want to prune them for keeping them a little bit more compact. And while suckers can be a little bit annoying because tomato plants can get out of hand pretty quickly, I have noticed that a benefit of them is if you have a plant that's struggling, maybe you have issues with disease, or I had one plant earlier that it just wasn't looking good and I didn't know why. But when I started seeing some of those suckers come out, I'm like, okay, it's going to rebound. So it's almost its way of regenerating itself if it has any kind of issues. So all that to say, I do prune them occasionally now. I don't necessarily have the I never prune the suckers approach like I used to, but again, that's something that I've learned through trial and testing and just learning as a gardener. So be willing to change up your methods because you never know what all you'll learn and what all you'll find works best for you. And finally, before we go, I wanted to give you an update on the green stalk garden I planted for my friend who had never grown a vegetable garden before. I'm so pleased to share that her garden is growing amazingly. She is already harvesting zucchini and cucumbers and tomatoes and lettuce and greens, and even more than that, she is so excited when she talks to me about it. She's even shared her garden to lots of different friends. I just love seeing the joy in her face as she's able to see what it's like to be able to grow her own food with very minimal effort. It makes me want to plant an instant garden for all of my friends that don't garden. I hope you've enjoyed this Q&A style video. If you have other questions that you'd like me to consider for another one, please let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for joining me today in my garden on this beautiful morning, although it's already getting humid. I hate the humidity here in Arkansas, but it's just part of it. And I'll catch you next time.